Hello, everybody. Today we have a very special guest with us, Saikat Majumdar, one of the most talked about writers in India today. The author of such critically acclaimed novels like Silverfish, The Firebird, The Scent of God, Middle Finger, and important non-fiction work like College Pathways of Possibilities, The Critic as Amateur, and Prose of the World, Saikat has emerged as one of the most fearless and one of the most original voices in Indian literature today. On June 17th, his latest novel, The Remains of the Body, was released, and we have Saikat with us in the Frontline office to talk about not just his latest work, but about his entire body of work down the years. Welcome, Saikat.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, really, and talking to you because you've been such a fantastic reader of my works. And Frontline and Hindu, I go back quite a way. I've been writing for them. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Well, Saikat, let me start off by asking you what The Remains of the Body essentially is about.
Well, it's a tough question. It's a very tough question to write about and talk about a novel. You say that when you have an answer, you write an article or a non-fiction work. When you have a question which you cannot answer, you write a novel or a poem. So it's kind of tricky. But what should I say? I mean, I guess there are two main themes of this book. One is marriage. And marriage is a very loaded subject, I think, for everybody. I like to say that marriage is a lot like blue cheese. With time, it starts to stink. But the true connoisseur appreciates the stench of cheese. So it's a bit like that. So marriage is a big subject. The other one is friendship. And here where I guess I've come to be accepted as a writer who talks about sexuality and the very fluid nature of sexuality, that what are the limits? What are the erotic limits of friendship between, say, heterosexual men? You know, when you know each other's bodies very closely, when you've grown up together, when you've attained puberty together, when you've kind of probably read porn together, things like that. But how is it that awareness is not sexualized? What are the limits? And I think the protagonist is a man who's asking the question like, why are we not pansexuals? Why are we drawn to certain genders? Why are we not drawn to different genders? And it's about these questions and how these questions and desires kind of triangulate the relationship between three characters, the two friends. One of them is married, so there's a woman. And it's a triangular relationship set against the backdrop of immigrant ambition. They set in North America. And I'd say it's probably my most erotically charged of my novels. Also probably the most sexually fluid. And also, interestingly, the shortest book I've written. It's actually 36,000 words, more like a novella than a novel. But it really came out in a kind of a burst. It really just happened very spontaneously. And I think it's a sensitive book. I don't know how people will react to it. But I'm happy that it's out in the world. And I'm looking forward to what people think about it.
Now, one thing that has intrigued me about it is that it was advertised as a Pride Month release, right? Now I've read the book. I wouldn't personally categorize it in any kind of, either Pride Month or any month release. It's just a book on relationships. Yeah. Now, why do you think this kind of categorization was applied here?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I think this really goes back to my 2019 novel, The Scent of God, which was set in a boarding school run by a Hindu monastic order. And two boys fall in love with each other. These are teenage boys, they're coming of age and they get attracted. And then things happen. And this novel attracted a lot of attention and was discussed, partly because this came out shortly after homosexuality was decriminalized in India. So Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code was decriminalized. And so there's a lot of attention on books coming out right after that, coming out. Obviously, the pun is unavoidable. And there was a lot of discussion, and And I think some activists found the book, oh, this is too soft, too hush-hush. Literally, people love the book. But I think since then, I've found a readership among people who like books which question sexuality, which question relationships, which question all these things. And it seemed like since this is a book which did all of that, and this being June is the month of pride, rainbow and kind of queerness is celebrated all over the world. They kind of put it together. I'm sure that's part of our publisher's very strategic decision. But you're absolutely right. It's not really a book which is about being labeled gay or straight or lesbian. It is definitely a book about very fluid sexualities where it's hard to say. I mean, I think one of the things I guess it comes across is I don't write books with messages, but I guess on hindsight, if I think one message this book puts out after having written it is that there's queerness in our lives everywhere. It's not something about I am queer or I'm straight or I'm gay, but even people who read the most normative lives have moments of queerness. There are moments of strange desire. And that is something that have been in my novels throughout. Even with the Firebird, a child is looking at his mother who's an actress, and there's an Oedipal connection. So there's always in the middle finger, the teacher and the student. So I've always been very interested in desire which cannot be labeled and desire which cannot be named. Sometimes it's dangerous desire. So the fluidity of it. But it's also desire which cannot be sort of put in a box. So in that sense, I can see why you see the pride level unsatisfying. But it's definitely a book about desire and kind of disruptive desire, which is energized my fiction for a long time. I find when you write about disruptive desire, your sentences have a certain energy because that quest, that erotic energy charges your syntax and it pushes you in a direction. And that's why I think this book came out so quickly. So there's something about queerness. It's a very queer book. And yet it's a book which definitely defies labels. So the Pride Month label is interesting and complicated.
There's this character called Postov that we come across in this particular novel, Remains of the Body. You're talking about the limits of friendship and where do you draw the line? Now, personally, I found the character to be quite obsessive. In fact, psychotically obsessive. If you think about the way he's obsessed about his friend's body, completely obsessed about their past as boys, and yet you've been very kind to him. You've not attributed anything dark or sinister in his motives, and he is the central character. He is the protagonist, and the story unfolds through his eyes. Did you spare him for any reason? Because you don't really spare your dark characters. For example, the psycho in Firebird who kills girls, and then there is there is always a psycho around somewhere in one novel. Even in the monastery, there was
yes.
in the Scent of God, and of course there was I don't recall any psycho in the Middle Finger, but. So tell us about something about Postov's obsession. Do you think that he's?
I love that you see them as a psycho. That's a great honor for any novelist to write a psycho. I love that. That's really hilarious. I want to talk a bit about the question of darkness you brought up. I think you're absolutely right. My earlier novels, especially Firebird, was very dark. But then, I've been thinking my last 3 novels have moved away from a space of darkness. I mean, in fact, some of them have been described as romances. Of course, a romance doesn't necessarily mean happiness. There's a twisted romance too. But I was reading this quote by Colm Tóibín, the Irish novelist, somewhere, that happiness is a very difficult subject for a novelist. It's much harder to write about happiness than about sadness. And I've been thinking a lot about that. What does happiness mean? And happiness and desire are connected. But of course, the desire is twisted. So the happiness is not the usual kind. And I'm very intrigued by your reading of Kaustav as a kind of a psycho character, because he is certainly obsessive, but you've read him with an intensity which I didn't see. And this is the best part about writing books. Your readers take control over books and they see things you don't see and you learn from them. So that's been a wonderful learning experience for me to kind of see that.
It was almost like the proprietorial claim that he has to his friend, which kind of seems a little unhealthy to me.
I think you're right. But, I've been thinking a lot about friendship between unlikely people, especially friendship with people who have different political opinions or different ideologies. And between Kaustav and Avik, Kaustav is the protagonist, you're absolutely right. Avik is completely different. He's kind of an alpha male. He used to play football, big guy, clumsy with women. Then he became a successful corporate guy. He studied science. Kaustav is very different. He's sensitive. He looks effeminate. He's thin. He's small. He understands women. And I think as he grew up, he realized how different Avik is from him. And I think this is there's a kind of irrational element in our friendship. I think we all know that we make friends with people in childhood. We won't spare 2 seconds for these people if we met them as adults. As adults, we become much more selective. We decide who we are going to, but childhood is a very strange time. And I think we cannot talk to most of our friends in kindergarten or in the early years of grade school because they're so different. Friends we make in college or, that is a different thing. And this is the element playing between Kaustav and Avik, that he is thinking about him. And in a way, because this novel is also set in North America, the question of home keeps coming back. And home is a motif in my fiction repeatedly. And there are 2 reasons behind it. I think people who live in different places think a lot about home. And then people who come from broken homes, which I am. I think I've come from a broken home. And the question of home haunts you all your life. And Kaustav is also dealing with that. And in some ways, Avik is a kind of a home for him. But at the same time, he's so different. But as you remember in the novel, there's a jolt. Because how Avik has dealt with his marriage, how Avik has dealt with Sunetra, comes as a revelation. That he's not that simple friend that I had. He's actually a kind of a bullying patriarch. So I think in a way, it's a kind of an epiphany that how people of such different kinds can be friends. And yet, the question of physical awareness, that's why it's called Remains of the Body. After everything that happens, in a way, the body remains. The body of the teenager he knew, the body of the football player in school and college, the body he grew up, and now in their mid-30s, middle age is starting to touch on them. And that, I think a lot about how we think about the bodies of our loved ones, our friends, maybe family members. We have an intense awareness of it. And yet it's not a sexualized awareness. And that is Kaustav's question. So all of these things I think have common because he's the narrator as well. It's the narrative consciousness. I think maybe it has really come out heavy. And I really think it is a compliment that you think of it as psycho, because I think of him as obsessive, but a psycho is taking a bit step ahead. But of course, any author would celebrate the creation of successful psychos. So thank you for that.
Well, I have a tendency to read a little bit too much into things.
That's a great one. I love that. I learned a lot from that reading.
But let's now talk about, you mentioned Sunetra. Mm-hmm. Now let's talk about, I've seen one thing. Let's talk about your woman characters of all your novels, with the exception of Silverfish, and of course also Silverfish, with the exception of
Scent of God.
Scent of God,
yes,
which had a few strong woman characters, but only on the side and fleeting by. So we're talking about you have very strong woman characters in your novel. For example, the story, the parallel story of the woman in
Silverfish, yes.
And then there is the character of Gorima in the protagonist's mother in
Firebird.
And there are 2 very strong characters, Megha and I forget her name.
Poonam. That novel is all about women.
That is all about women. And there are 2 very strong women characters there. And then there is Sunetra, who is as much a central character as Kaustav is. So tell us something about the woman characters. Where do they come from?
Right. No, that's one of my greatest satisfactions. I think as a writer, I've been called a very political writer, but I don't write about elections. I don't write about riots. I don't write about sort of the big headline kind of a things. But I'm very interested in the politics of the bedroom, the politics of the tea shop, the politics of the office, the politics of personal relationships. And I think in that sense, I'm a feminine writer. I think of myself as a feminine writer in the sense I have seen women writers deal with these private spaces beautifully. I mean, male writers have also done it, but male writers are often drawn to the public sphere in a kind of overarching way. You know, of course, there are writers like Joyce and Lawrence who write about this sort of personal sphere beautifully. But all the writers I admire most are writers who talk about politics. And I think that has given me something of a sense of women, something of the sense of women in literature. And I'm very drawn to that. Of course, a lot of it does go back to Garima and Firebird is, of course, a very character of great personal importance because, as you probably know, my mother was an actress. My mother was a theater actress. And while the Firebird is a novel and it's made up, there's a tiny bit of autobiographical inspiration. That opening scene where Ori is watching his mother die on a stage, that was my own memory. And my mother passed away in her 50s. And in some ways, she has left a kind of a aura of this beautiful but destructive life. You know, that she was there on stage, but she made a mess of her life. My parents were divorced when I was young. And I had a traumatic childhood. So I think that has kind of created a sense of femaleness as a huge artistic force. That I write about men, I write about boys because that's who I am. But at the same time, I think strong women have remained somehow. You know, Kamal in Silverfish, I mean, a novel, my early novel, I'd say. I mean, the whole idea of women in 19th century Bengal trying to learn literacy. They were eavesdropping outside their brothers getting private tuition. And this woman is writing her memoir as she's learning the alphabet. And these are true stories. These are things you read about. You read novels of Ashapurna Devi. You get this actual story. So there is that sense. But Firebird is the turning point because Firebird created Garima, and that whole world. And then when I wrote, I mean, Scent of God has been described as a very male novel, but not a masculine novel. This was a publisher friend of mine, Feminist Press, she told me that. I love the description. It's male, but it's not masculine because these are boys who love each other. These are boys. So it's obviously the element of homosexual desire questions masculinity. And Middle Finger, you know, I wanted to write a kind of a contemporary campus retelling of the Drona Ekalavya story. Drona and Ekalavya.
I think it was wonderfully written.
You know,
I think it's very subtly done.
Thank you. And at the same time, there was this whole Plato's idea of that erotic connection with your student. So I wanted to write a story where Drona and Ekalavya fall in love with each other. And I thought, why not make them women? Because clearly the sort of the art that is in question in the Drona story is archery. But in my novel, it's poetry. And when it comes to poetry, I wanted to imagine, and I think that was in some ways kind of daring for me because I am quite at ease writing women characters. Writing characters of a different class is a bigger challenge. So Poonam was the biggest challenge for me to write, that she's not only a woman, but she's a tribal woman, a Christian tribal woman who wants to write poetry. So that was very challenging for me. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. These are all very strong women. They're exceptional women. They're talented women, but they're full of self-doubt because I think talented people are the most filled with self-doubt. Talented people are the most tortured people because they are the least happy people. And my women are like that. They are talented, but they're constantly asking questions. And Sunatra, again, she's a scientist. This time she's not in the arts, but she's a scientist. And as a scientist, you know, there's so many questions you have to deal with. Where is funding? What is happening? And I realized that often in a marriage, the defining question, the defining contention, if two intelligent, career-driven people are married to each other, the contention becomes career. Oh, I want this, I want that. And this is the conflict which I wanted to show. And I think much of the novel is about Sunatra breaking out of this kind of soft patriarchal control. Like, you know, I love you, I want what's good for you. But I love you becomes a way of controlling your life. And I was very intrigued by whether a woman can break out of that. So that was kind of daring, but that is the source of the sin. But you're absolutely right. I am very preoccupied with strong women, and I hope I do justice to my women characters.
Well, I just one thing that occurred to me was that whereas Gorima destroys herself, in the sense that Gorima is self-destructs, the others kind of attain a level of liberation through the strength of their personality by breaking out, in the sense that both Megha and Poonam, they break out of the conventions of society and of academics and find solace in each other and in each other's art. And the same with Sunetra. She breaks out of a marriage that she finds confining, restrictive, and claustrophobic. And the book kind of ends. I'm not going to give anything away from the book, but the book doesn't end in a tragedy. The book ends with a sunshine. The book ends with kind of a serenity. And the same we find in in your first novel, where this book comes out into the open. The very fact that it has found its way into public domain is a liberation of sorts.
Right. No, that's very interesting. I think happiness is a very tricky thing. What do you want?
What I'm trying to say is the way out, the way to one's happiness. Is rebellion the way to personal happiness? Is breaking out the way to personal happiness you feel for women?
I don't think there are any simple answers. Rebellion works for some people, it destroys others. You don't have answers to these questions when you set out to write a novel, because part of the experience of writing a novel is creating characters who very quickly run away from you. They don't listen to you. They just sort of do their own thing. And that's when you lose control over your characters, you realize the novel is really working. It's become a live animal. It's not going to listen to you. That being said, I think with Firebird, I think I sometimes think I couldn't have written that novel if my mother was alive. In a way, that whole death of the mother and the role Ori plays, very indirect role, very psychological role in her death. I don't know if I could have written it if my mother was actually around. So that's been very personal, and in some ways, the whole sort of gloom of death. Because death is such a powerful thing on stage and on live, tragedy, all of that came together. But other than that, all the novels, I think they're different things, like Kamal in Silverfish is a powerless woman. She's living in 19th century Bengal, her life. And I think the whole idea was how she, as a powerless woman in 19th century Bengal, her life echoes this school teacher in 1980s Calcutta who's running around to get his pension released from the communist government, from a corrupt communist government. So I think I was trying to tell how certain voices get lost. Megha, of course, is much more empowered. She's educated. She's a Princeton PhD. She's much more... She's dealing with what it means to be brown in the US. And when you're suddenly in India, you are suddenly the white person. You become empowered. And how do you deal with someone like Poonam, who's a tribal person? There, suddenly the power game shifts from gender to caste and other forms of identity.
Yet still she feels stifled.
Oh yeah, she feels stifled. I think, her poetry was very much rooted to a certain sense of being a racial minority, which was working when she was in New Jersey. Suddenly when she's in Delhi, she feels that is gone. My poetry came out of pain. Now there's no pain, so I can't write. So it was difficult. And if you remember in that novel, she starts writing again much later when she starts missing Poonam, when Poonam is gone. And poetry makes a kind of a sharp return in her life. So, and I think, in the endings are, a novel is just a slice of life, just the way a painting is. And what I've realized is when you end a novel, characters' lives go on. You're just putting a frame around it. And often, my ending of my novels, people have said, reviewers have often said, the ending feels like the beginning to something else. I said, yes, absolutely. But I just don't know what the beginning is. So obviously, when Megha and Poonam meet again at the end of Middle Finger, it feels like something might start. Just that we don't know what that start is. This novel ends with something happening to a marriage. I'm not going to give it out now. But, you know, when a marriage reaches a certain stage, it's simply another chapter. So, and one line that has stayed with me, I've been talking about this, that Sunetra is saying, sometimes the scariest thing is the chance to live by your own convictions. So when you finally actually get to lead the life you really wanted, then it's very scary. Because then you have no one to blame. Then you and your convictions are bare naked against each other. I think Garima was truly destructive, and I think there's something destructive about theater. Theater is a very destructive, I think all art forms are destructive, but theater has a kind of a raw power when you break the fourth wall. And I wanted to capture that when you see somebody in the makeup room, and these are my own experiences too. That is very destructive. And I think that Shakespearean worldview of a tragic world, you can't escape out of that. But other novels have been different. There have been different kinds. Women are younger, women of different age. But it's very hard to say, what they are. Only thing I can say is that they are all intelligent women, they're talented women, but they're fighting different kind of demons, and the results are different.
But one thing that I have sort of noticed about the 5 novels that you have written so far, that it's almost like a painter going through certain phases, right? A blue phase or a purple phase. For example, there is in the structure of your books, I mean. For example, with Silverfish and Firebird, we have a dual narrative, right? So there is a story within a book, and another is a story unfolding parallel to the story that is happening. And somewhere in Firebird, the 2 stories converge with devastating effect. But there's still 2 parallel stories happening, totally separate from each other. That's like one way of writing. And then we see another structure which came up in The Scent of God and in the middle finger, where we're seeing academia, we're seeing 2 people, we're seeing the mentor and student relationship, and we're seeing in The Scent of God, it is a very overt, it is a very definite statement of homosexual love, where in the
middle finger muted,
it's kind of a little muted, it's kind of a little ambivalent. So are your books meant to be read in pairs? Even though I must say that the time space between Silverfish and Firebird was about 8 years.
8 years,
so,
yes.
Right?
The second novel came
So
after 8 years later.
After a long time.
Yes,
So structurally they were similar. I mean, not similar, but there were affinities.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what do you have to say about that?
I think that's a very interesting observation. I never thought about my novels in this way, but I think you've raised a very good point. Obviously, the first 3 novels are very much Calcutta novels. That's one classification. Silverfish, Firebird, Scent of God, Calcutta and suburbs. Firebird and Silverfish are more city novels because they bring out the character of the city. Also the parallel narrative, as you said, Bengal and contemporary. But theater, communist government, they're both very much rooted in the communist government. I think Firebird and Scent of God are also parallel because they're both Bildungsroman. They're both coming of age stories, right? The young boy. That was a time I was fascinated with childhood. I still am. As a writer, I'm fascinated by childhood and early youth, because when you're young, you're hit by a powerful experience which you don't understand. And this gulf between experience and understanding is a very great space for art. I never thought I'd write about adults. I thought children is my domain. With Middle Finger, I broke out of it. I wrote about adults. But Middle Finger and Scent of God, again, have educational institutions in common. One is a boarding school. The other one is a college university setting. So again, education, I think, is a running theme in my work because, I mean, obviously I write about education in other spaces. But as a novelist, I'm very interested in how human beings become who they are, the making of human beings. How do they learn? How do they grow? How do they sexually come of age? How do they define themselves? Those questions are very interesting. So those 2 novels were my coming of age novels. And then from Middle Finger, I think I've moved a bit away from Calcutta as a milieu. Part of it is set in the US, part of it is set in Delhi. Calcutta plays a very important but a small role. And again, from Scent of God onwards, the question of desire becomes very marked. So Scent of God, Middle Finger, Remains of the Body, they are very much about desire, and kind of desire that is hard to understand, desire that seems forbidden, desire that seems dangerous, desire that is muted in many ways or comes out. This is probably my most erotically explicit book. But again, so these are absolutely right. I think it's a very interesting way of thinking that why does a novelist go through different phases? I think the painting metaphor you bring up is very apt, because I've always been an atmospheric writer. People ask me, what do you think about character, plot? I say, I think about atmosphere. If an atmosphere is magnetic, I have to evoke it. With Firebird, the atmosphere of theater was so magnetic. Watching a play from the wings, bring in a green room, the smell of makeup. In The Scent of God, the erotic eruption in an ashram, where it's supposed to be a celibate space, but two boys touching each other. That was such a magnetic atmosphere. So, but then again, I mean, Middle Finger was obviously more of a desire to rewrite this mythical story. But Remains of the Body, again, is a departure in that the North American suburb has a certain quietness and silence, which allows me to move away from atmosphere and look into the inner life of characters. So it's the most internal of my novels.
Absolutely.
Most sort of focuses inward, because when snow is falling outside, it's complete silence. It's not like Calcutta where there's a carnival going on. There's noise, you cannot take away, which is not to say you cannot have interior life in a city like this, but the silence of the suburb really allowed me. So I think you're absolutely right. In many ways, sort of atmosphere, color, theme, structure, I can see a certain progression throughout in my novels. Also, it's fascinating that when I was living in the US, I was writing about India. Now that I'm in India, I'm writing about the US. So clearly, a writer always writes about the space that is absent. For me, memory is very important. I must not possess the place. I must be able to away from the place to write about it. And that's clearly what I've been doing.
So like talking about when you said that, and very, very aptly you said that this is perhaps one of the most internally presented, like one of the most internal, the whole novel is an extremely internal affair that way.
Yes.
For want of a better term. So that makes it the least cinematic. If you look at it,
right.
The other novels,
right,
the Firebird and even Scent of God, and even the Middle Finger. You have the poetry reading sessions, the underground poetry reading sessions there. You have a lot of you have a lot of action there. You have a lot of, but here it's all within the protagonist's mind. It's the protagonist's perception of what he sees around him, the conflict, memories, distant memories, flashes of memories, fragmented memories. So all these factors, it's a very marked departure from all your other books, I must say. So are we seeing you heading into from this book onwards, like I said, I'm seeing things in pairs here. So you got like Silverfish and Firebird to be read together, not to be read together as a pair. Scent of God and
Middle Finger
is a pair. So what's the next one after the or you want to go away somewhere totally different?
One can never say. Novels take possession of you. You don't choose them, and they come to you, and they kind of take hold of you and say, "Write me." I don't think I'll ever be done with Calcutta as a theme. It's an amazing, amazing city. It's just, hard for me.
Yeah, I know, but sorry to interrupt, but you have this fixation with the Calcutta that you grew up in.
Yes.
That's the 80s Calcutta.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. Load-shedding character Calcutta, the militant
communist, and the theater, the slogans, the street marches, the traffic jams, all of that, yes.
So, but this book comes out of the Remains of the Body seems to come out of that.
Yeah.
Remains of the Body seems to be a little more
contemporary Calcutta, even though you choose a part of Calcutta that reminds you most of the 80s.
Yeah, that's so difficult. No, I mean, today I came here, it took me like 20 minutes to get here from Park Street and all these new flyovers. I'm like, I don't think I can imagine getting from Park Street to Topshia so fast. So I think it's very difficult. I think if you leave, I was living in Calcutta College in MA, 99 I left. I think that, the reason you write about a place is not just the place, but what is the relation between time and place. So that was such a susceptible time, growing up, childhood, college. Those powerful impressions are very hard to, and one returns to it. I think one returns to it more as one grows older. I don't think I've quite formed a relationship with Calcutta in the 21st century. Of course, I keep coming a lot. I write for the newspapers here. I come and teach, but I'm still a visitor, and that's, so I think in some ways, I don't know if this Calcutta will come up, but it's very hard to say. I think I have another Calcutta novel in me. It's very hard to predict what will happen, but all I know is that there has to be a sense of elusive desire. I mean, something which is not there. One of the reasons why I write about that Calcutta is because that Calcutta is not quite there. And yet it's not quite not there either, because Calcutta as a city, I think, changes the least. And when I come to Calcutta, I still live in North Calcutta, which has changed even less of all of Calcutta. So North Calcutta seems very similar. So it's very hard to say, but I don't know. I think I'm off late. I've been driven by sort of this unsolved questions of desire which drive you, and then you kind of look for it. Like this question came, and and its relationship with the atmosphere is something which depends how it comes. It all depends, but it's a fascinating thing. I just don't know. I have a very rough idea sketchy idea of a novel, also a very disturbing subject, which I'm thinking about, but I haven't started writing it. I think I need to give it a little more time to sort of simmer in my mind. But place and atmosphere will always remain, either directly atmospherically, or atmosphere is always a character in my novels. That I think will never change. Whether it's the sound and bustle of Calcutta traffic jam or the snow of a Quebec cottage, that'll always be there.
I'm going to ask you, since you have talked about the germination of a prose novel that's right now forming within you, to give us the process of your writing. How does it start from an idea for which you proceed, or is it more of a rigorous practice of sitting down every day, writing something like non-writers?
And there are couple of different ways. I think, Silverfish, I like the story, and yet I feel it's my less mature novel. I think part of the reason was that I was also very driven by this academic idea of what you call minority history. That what happens, who are the people on the fringes of history who don't have a voice, like Kamal was the widow from 19th century, like Millen is. And yet I also met somebody who was in Millen's position. So I have found novels for me which begin with ideas are probably slightly weaker novels. It's not something I don't want to emphasize too much, but I think in that sense, Middle Finger started with an idea that I wanted to do something with this Dronacharya story. And whereas all the other novels have powerful and disturbing visceral questions behind them. Like, with Firebird, that memory of mother and all that, Scent of God, that question of desire, and even here, the question of desire. So I think I need something bothering you. Beginning of a novel is like an itch. It's kind of scratching, but I can't solve it. And that itch creates a kind of an entropy. It creates a kind of a narrative energy. And then you write, and then you think who the characters will be. And I think once you get started, it's like there's something pushing. And the momentum comes and it just flows. It just flows. And a lot of it is, of course, finding language, like dialogue. Like in this novel, for some reason, I decided not to put any quotation marks around dialogues. I guess that came very naturally. I wanted that fluidity. I wanted people to be able to tell who's speaking by the content, not by quotation marks. So there's some confusions.
Also, perhaps the fact that it is perhaps one of the most internal of all your novels. So if things are happening inside you.
Probably after that too. I mean, I think if the earlier novels are more like cinema stuff, this is more like a Netflix show, very internal, happening indoors, that kind of a thing. One thing I've realized, and I don't know how to deal with it, that my books are different books. I think most of my books are different. There are some abiding things. I'm very committed to style. I'm very committed to language. As a reader, of course, I cannot pick up a book unless the language does something to me. I don't read books for their subjects. I read books for their treatment of subjects. And I think same with me, I think the language has to be something important. There has to be a certain evocation of character. But beyond that, I don't know. It keeps changing. It was education earlier on. Now it seems to be desire. Desire and education overlap. Who knows what it will be in the future? But some kind of a human impulse, which is intensely political in a private way, and which doesn't have an easy answer. I think that is my defining sort of motivation for writing novels.
So who are the novelists that you're reading now? Anybody that's that you find interesting, language-wise?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously grew up with the modernists. They were big influences, some are now contemporary. Yeah, there are a lot of interesting novelists. I'm
more interested in those from India.
Yeah, I actually also read more novels from people from India, actually, which I think is very interesting. So a couple of writers, I'd say, obviously writers who deal with questions of desire are quite interesting to me. So someone like R. Raj Rao from Pune, he's a gay writer. I think gay writers are among the few writers who are writing explicit sexual passages. And that's another question, I think. Why don't we have more erotic writing? And I think there's a reason behind it. Erotic writing had a long tradition of objectifying women, which is why gay writers are doing a better job. So I think his work I quite like. There are a couple of other writers who talk about desire in a very interesting way. They're not necessarily queer. A writer called Manjul Bajaj. I think, writes in English, but it's very much like the Chugtai Manto tradition of that North Indian Punjab, UP, that tradition. A writer I very much like is Suhrid Chattopadhyay, also writes in Hindi and English. There are 2 novellas published. I was in a panel with her at Jaipur Lit Fest, where she really brings rural Rajasthan to life. I've always been drawn to writers who do the vernacular in English, sort of bring out a kind of a local life, which is why I've always admired Amit Chaudhary's writing, because he does life in Bengal in English in a very interesting way. So people like Anukriti and Manjul do that, I think, beautifully with respect to North India. So there are some really interesting, I've been reading a biography of the Indian writer Nirmal Verma by this writer called Vineet Gill. Beautiful biography, which almost reads like a novel. I've also, speaking of writers outside, I enjoyed reading Sally Rooney's first 2 books, Conversation with Friends and Normal People. I think she does desire very well. But I think the question of why people won't actually talk about sex in writing is something which bothers me. Hasta Shavendra Shekhar talks about it in My Father's Garden. But I think it's a subject which people kind of dodge around. So there are some very interesting writers, who are writing in English, and there are others who write in translation. But I pay particular attention to people who write in English, not just from India, but also from other colonial spaces like South Africa and all, because I think it's a intense reality of a life, that how do you write in English, how do you speak in English when there's a polyphony of other languages? And that theme keeps coming back to me. So there are some interesting writers there whom I really like reading. Yep.
Shriko, thanks a lot. We had a lovely conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your wonderful questions.